Welcome to episode 10 of Read by the Author. Tonight I will be continuing reading Time Anomaly, which is the second book in the ECHO TRILOGY. And so we're in the middle of the story. We're on chapter 23, and let's get started. Oh, I do want to say, before we dive into the story, I feel like I need to say that my dog, if you're on the video, here she is, my dog, Tesla, is in the room with me. And she is snoring. So I apologize. She just really wanted to be around me. And I can't say no to her. She's really cute. 23. Pain and Gain. Seth and I walked arm in arm alongside the caravan of burdened donkeys, Haru, my ever-present sentinel, following several paces behind us. All three of us were bedecked in our linen desert robes and cowls, as was everyone else, making us look like a procession of overheated, sweaty Halloween ghosts. It was our fourth day on the hot, dry trek through the Sahara toward the Netjarat oasis, and I was fairly certain I had sand pretty much everywhere. The ceaseless hours of hand-to-hand defense lessons Haru required every night ensured that, as did the literal hole-in-the-sand latrines. Seth glanced over her shoulder at her brother, then leaned closer to me. He is taking this task of watching over you very seriously, is he not? She whispered. There was a suggestive twinkle in her eyes. Trust me, Seth, nothing like that has happened. I told her just as quietly, keeping my eye on Haru's expression to gauge whether or not he could hear what we were saying. And nothing like that can happen. I suppose. A wistful sigh escaped from her. But you are feeling better with the withdrawals, yes? I nodded. She was quiet for a moment. You could still tell him about the two of you in the future, no? Even if you do not act on your feelings. He does not even know that I am from the future. I really do not think. Seth tutted me. You will have to block everyone's memories of you when you depart anyway. Everyone's except yours and Nikure's, I thought, which she was perfectly aware of. So why not at least be honest with him? He will not remember until your time, and you will feel less burdened in this time. I chewed on the inside of my cheek. I am afraid. Of? I sighed. I fear he will think I am insane, and that I will drive him away. If you had told him when you first arrived, perhaps, but he knows you now, and he knows that you are a little different. She paused. I think you should tell him. I sighed. What does Nuin think? Glancing back at Heru, I found his eyes on me. I offered him a quick smile, then leaned closer to Seth. He agrees. Or at least when I first arrived, he agreed that I should not tell Haru, that he found the idea of bonding, of being tied to someone so completely distasteful, and that telling him we were bondmates in the future would only make him avoid me. But we have not spoken of it since then. In fact, we have not spoken much at all. I exhaled in exasperation and shook my head. Maybe I should tell him. Maybe I shouldn't. I just don't know. An almost electric thrill washed over me, and I stumbled. Only my link with Seth's arm kept me on my feet. She halted beside me as what felt like a burst of lightning pulsed in my chest, and I doubled over. Lex? Seth's voice sounded panicked. Lex? Haru! But there was no need for her to call to him. He was already there, right behind me, one arm wrapped around my shoulders and crossing my chest, the other clutching my waist. Were it not for him, I would have collapsed onto my hands and knees.
What is it?
Haru said, his breath brushing my cheek.
Is this the same ailment as before?
I clutched his forearm. No, I breathed. This felt nothing like bonding withdrawals. This felt so much worse. I looked at Seth, who was standing in front of me, her awestruck face mere inches from mine. Your eyes, they are... Another burst of electric power exploded from my chest, and the agony reached all the way to my fingertips and toes. Smoky wisps of every shade of red, orange, and yellow pulsed from the exposed skin on my hands. I was betting the same was visible on my face. "Get Nuin," I managed to say through gritted teeth. Aset nodded, her face ashen. She turned and sprinted away, tripping over her robe only once. I groaned under the sheer force of the next wave of power. My breaths were quick and shallow, and I could hear others around me, some murmuring, some shouting. Russ, bundled in his linen sling, yowled and dug his needle-like claws into my chest. I somehow managed to dig him out from under the layers of linen and hand him off to the nearest person. Deny, I thought. "Haru," I gasped. "Get me away from everyone. They cannot see this. They cannot see what I am. If a pep is riding along inside any one of them." Heru didn't hesitate in scooping me up, cradling me in his arms. He broke into a run, calling over his shoulder that only Nuin, Set, Nakure, and Aset were allowed to follow, adding a warning that he would personally eviscerate any others who dared to defy him. He sprinted over a low dune, then around a taller one, skidding several times on the descent, but never coming close to dropping me. When we reached a deep valley between several sand dunes, he fell to his knees, still cradling me. He was looking at my face, into my eyes, when the next wave of power broke free. His lips parted as he stared at me, wonder altering his every feature. For seconds, or maybe minutes, we stared into each other's eyes.
"Thank you, Heru, but you have to release her now,"
Nuin said, his voice calm and sure. Heru tightened his hold on me.
"No. Alexandra, can you hear me?"
I could feel the pressure building again, and I whimpered.
"Heru, you must release her and return to the others."
Haru's eyes finally left mine, and the look he turned on Nuin was filled with defiance. "Go," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut. It was about to happen again, and this time I was certain it would be way more than a burst of power. This was going to be an explosion, and I feared it would tear apart anything near me. I feared it would tear me apart. "Go!" I howled, my voice filled with desperation, with agony, with power. "Go!" Heru finally heeded my demand, handing me over to Nuin. "Go," I repeated. "Go, go, go."
"He is gone, dear Alexandra. It is just the two of us now."
Nuin's voice was soothing. "He will make it better. He will make me better." I was so sure.
"I'm going to remove the shield, and we will both be surrounded by the outpouring of excess power for a short time. But the chute will expend itself, and you will be okay again."
He hugged me against him, and I realized I was crying, sobbing. The force of the convulsions racking my body was making him shake as well. Unable to respond with words, I nodded.
"All right, child. Just breathe."
Nuin's voice resonated with power.
"Breathe."
I had no choice but to follow his command. He pressed his lips to my forehead, pulling down the block. And I screamed. I felt like I had been lit on fire. The desert and clear blue afternoon sky disappeared, and in their stead, our own private aurora borealis burst into life. Countless rainbow tendrils snaking around us. They were alive. They were feeding off me, consuming me. Again, I screamed, and it was the sound of a soul dying. With a whoosh, the colors retracted, imploding until once again they fit snugly inside me.
"Breathe, my Alexandra,"
Nuin told me, a hint of strain marbling his calm tone.
"Breathe."
I sucked in a breath of air.
"Good. Again. Breathe. Good girl."
"What the hell was that?" I asked between gasping breaths.
"That," Nuin said, raising his eyebrows, "was entirely my fault."
I closed my eyes and focused on taking long, steady breaths. "Meaning?"
"Meaning, it's time for us to start your training in earnest."
24. oath-bound and awestruck. If Heru had his way, he would have carried me like a helpless baby the final few hours of the afternoon's journey. I was starting to think Heru would prefer to just stick me under his arm and cart me around in general, if only to keep me out of harm's way. Though he may have had a point on this one occasion. Once I convinced him to put me down, about 15 minutes after the caravan had resumed its slow but steady parade across the desert, I proceeded to stumble and trip over basically nothing for the next 15 minutes. I was bone-weary, but at least it was a weariness that wore off fairly quickly. By the time we made camp beside an enormous rocky outcropping, I felt more or less normal, if a little jittery. Super random author's note. I don't know why, but rocky outcroppings appear a lot in my books, and those words are apparently the only words I can think of to like describe them, because I feel like I'm always writing rock outcropping or rocky outcropping. I don't know why. It just happens. Not even the wary glances sent my way were overly bothersome. Nothing seemed unsettling in comparison to Haru's silence all afternoon. He stayed by my side, ready to reach out and steady me if I needed him, but he said nothing. And every time I met his eyes, I saw questions and fear, and worst of all, accusation.
"What is wrong with her?"
he asked as we approached Nuin, who was standing with Seth at the very edge of camp. Nuin didn't answer. He simply looked past us, nodded at someone behind us, and started walking along the perimeter of the outcropping, away from camp.
"Come with me."
Heru, Seth, and I exchanged a confused look. I shrugged, then started after Nuin, and Heru and Seth had little choice but to follow. Hearing footsteps crunching in the rock-strewn sand behind us, I looked over my shoulder. Nakure was trotting to catch up. Nuin led us around a jutting cliffside, up a narrow path that passed between the face of the cliff and a huge natural monolith, and finally toward an uneven break in the cliff's wall. I picked up my pace to catch up to him, but Heru caught my wrist. When I looked over my shoulder, meeting his eyes, my breath hitched. Because I knew the man he would one day become so well. I knew what those desperate golden eyes were asking. "Will you stay where I can see you? Will you let me protect you? Will you let me know your secrets? Will you let me know you? Will you trust me?" I stopped trying to pull my wrist free of his grasp. "I would tell you everything, Haru. I really would, if I thought you would believe me." He simply stared down at me, his eyes demanding answers I wasn't willing to give him. I touched my free hand to the one he'd wrapped around my wrist, pushing it lower so our fingers could link together. "I have a feeling that what you are about to see is going to give you some of the answers you seek." I continued on to the opening of the cliff's wall, Heru right behind me, our fingers still linked. He squeezed my hand when I pulled too far ahead, and again I looked back at him.
"Netjerat, we pretend to be gods," he said, stopping just before the opening. "We pretend to be gods, but..." I turned to face him. "Are you a true Netjer? A true goddess?" I smiled, laughing softly, and raised my hand to trail my fingertips down the side of his face. His stubble felt rough and a little sweat dampened. Sometimes I still feel like a regular old human, and other times I feel like a young Netjeret who is drowning in events and powers that are so far beyond her comprehension. I sighed. But most of the time I simply feel lost. I honestly do not know what I am anymore. Haru's jaw tensed under my fingertips, but those liquid gold eyes softened. "I see you. I know what you are." A half-hearted laugh bubbled in my chest. "And what is that?" He smiled, and my soul sang. "My little queen." He lowered himself to his knees and gazed up at me, those eyes no longer warm, but hard and determined. "I live to serve Alexandra. My life is yours, Alexandra. May you live forever." I stared down at him, dumbfounded. He'd attempted to pledge an oath to me once before, and I had denied him.
And now, though he had spoken in a completely different language, the words were essentially the same. Tears welled in my eyes. It was so hard to treat him like he was a different person from Marcus when he did things like this, proving that he truly was the same man. A smile touched my lips as the tears broke free. I placed my hands on his shoulders, sliding them up his neck until they were on either side of his head. I would rather have your friendship than your obedience, my Haru. Because this Haru was my Haru as much as Marcus was.
You have both,
he said, his voice rough. My heart seemed to clench, and the tears only increased. Catching movement out of the corner of my eye, I glanced away from Haru. Seth and Nikure were hanging back near an outcropping in the cliff's face, giving us privacy. Haru stood, and my hands slid down the front of his body. I closed my eyes, enjoying this single, lone chance to feel that soft skin, that hard muscle beneath my fingertips. His hands were on my face, his thumbs wiping away my tears, and I so desperately wanted to lean into him, to kiss him, to feel his soul merge with mine, which would kill him. I opened my eyes and pulled my hands away from his abdomen. Clearing my throat, I took a step backward. I shall test your claim right now, then. He stared at me, his face unreadable. I held my arm out toward the opening in the cliff's wall. Please, join Nuin. I just need a moment to collect myself, and then I will join you. His face hardened into a recognizable expression. Defiance.
I would prefer not to leave you alone out here.
I offered him a weak smile. It was the best I could do. I will not be alone. I nodded at Seth and Nikure, who were heading toward us. Heru hesitated, but after a few heartbeats, he stepped around me. A few seconds later, he was gone from my sight. I sat on a small boulder, waiting for the urge to cry to pass and wiping the remainder of my tears from my cheeks.
You have made a mess of your call,
Seth said in his broken English as he neared. Nikure passed me, heading through the break in the rock wall, but Seth hung back. I laughed dryly. What I wouldn't give for some waterproof coal.
A product available in your time.
Something like that. Seth crouched in front of me and tore a small piece of linen from the hem of his kilt.
I offer to help.
He raised the cloth, bringing it close to my face.
If you will allow me to.
Author's note. I have always loved this scene. I've always loved, there's obviously he's her father. There's nothing romantic about it, but I just love this, interaction between the two of them. It's so sweet. I smiled and nodded, and he touched the cloth to the skin under my eyes, wiping gently. Unlike Haru, whose two identities had now merged in my mind, a dangerous reality, I saw this Seth and the one from my time as two distinctly separate people. This Seth was kind, generous, and exceptionally thoughtful, none of which were words anyone would use to describe a Pepset.
I have questions for you as well, and hope you will give honest answer.
I licked my lips and swallowed. Ask away. I'm all ears.
All ears, he laughed. Your language has such strange sayings.
I grinned. I think every language has strange sayings.
This is truth.
So, what did you want to ask me? Seth hesitated, frowning the slightest amount.
When first we met, you had fear in your eyes. Fear of me.
He was quiet for a moment as he continued to wipe the tear-smudged coal off my face.
I have hurt you. In your time, I think. Is this truth?
It was my turn to hesitate, but considering that I was going to wipe his mind of all memory of me when I left this ancient time, I figured I might as well tell him at least some of our shared history. I captured his wrist and pulled his hand lower, holding it in both of mine. Looking into his warm, coffee-brown eyes, I said, Yes, Seth, you did hurt me. At his crestfallen look, I added, But you didn't have a choice, and it wasn't your fault. I know this now.
I do not understand.
His brow furrowed, and he shook his head.
Why would I do such a thing?
I shrugged. It's complicated.
We are related in some way, no?
I blinked and my mouth fell open. Why? What makes you think that? He smiled, just a little.
The resemblance is impossible to miss, I think. Seth and the Kure have commented on this to me as well.
Well, they didn't say anything to me. I cleared my throat. Yeah, we're related. A pregnant silence hung between us, waiting, expanding.
Are you my daughter?
A breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding whooshed out of my lungs, and I closed my eyes. I nodded. Suddenly his arms were around me, and I was sobbing, and I didn't understand why. Seth rubbed my back as I clung to him.
I am here, my daughter. I am here.
By the time Seth and I made it through the break in the cliff's wall and into a wide cavern lit by periodic cracks in the stone overhead, my eyes were dry and my makeup was as tidy as it could have been after the repeated waterworks. The floor was soft sand, cool through the bottoms of my leather moccasins, but overhead the ceiling was dripping with stalactites, some long enough that I had to be careful as I walked around to avoid bonking my head. Nuin, Haru, and Nakure were standing in the relative center of the space, speaking in hushed tones.
Come, dear Alexandra,
Nuin said, holding his hand out to me. I approached him. What are we doing in here, oh he who loves mystery above all things? Nakure made a choking noise, and I glanced at him. He was trying not to smile. Nuin narrowed his eyes, but I thought I spotted a tiny sparkle of amusement. He looked at the three Negerettes who were standing side by side.
As you witnessed today, Alexandra is not merely Netjerat.
Nakure and Seth already knew what Nuin was sharing, but Heru didn't. I focused on Haru's face as Nuin spoke. His eyes, too, stayed locked on mine.
Just as I am not merely Netjerat. But my time in this body is coming to an end, and it was essential that I pass on my power, my shoot, to another. I chose Alexandra as the recipient, because it is what had to be.
He paused for a moment, and I thought he must have been considering what other half-truths to share.
But Alexandra is still physically Netjerat, and as such, her body is not able to fully handle the power I have given her, just as no other Netjerat would be able to do it. She must learn to control it and regularly expend it so it does not overwhelm her and quite literally explode out of her, as it did today. Doing so will extend the time she has to complete the tasks she is destined for before the shoot destroys her completely.
Haru's eyes snapped to Nuin and his entire body went rigid.
Destroys her?
Nuin laughed softly.
I tell you that my own life is coming to an end and you say nothing, but I mention that Alexandra is in danger and you react quite differently.
He grinned.
This pleases me. It makes me think that you must be taking very good care of my beloved wife.
I stared at Nuin, my eyes narrowed. I hadn't the slightest clue why he would say something like that, and would say it teasingly, not accusingly. It was almost like he wanted Haru and me to have a physical relationship, which he knew was impossible. Haru clenched his jaw.
I would never dishonor either you or her in such a way.
Nuin made a noncommittal noise, and I was pretty sure he winked at me. Cheeks flaming, I shook my head and forced myself not to look at Haru. I had no clue what Nuin was thinking. Did he want me to doom the timeline by bonding with and killing Haru?
Now, dear Alexandra, Nuin said, I will teach you how to stop time and to jump from place to place at will, and tonight I will teach you how to use some of your more subtle mental abilities.
He touched my forehead, and based on the sudden widening of the three Negerettes' eyes, I was betting that my own eyes were on fire with power. I looked at Nuin, waiting for instructions.
Set,
he said, pointing to the cavern wall on my left.
Go stand over there.
He turned his attention to Heru and pointed to the opposite wall.
Over here, Heru.
Nakure he directed to the cavern opening. All three moved quickly, and once they were standing in their assigned spots, facing us, Nuin smiled at me.
Go to Heru.
The corners of my mouth tensed as I took my first step toward Heru, and when Nuin grabbed my arm, holding me back, I frowned. What? Still smiling, Nuin shook his head.
Using the chute. Go to Heru.
I took a deep breath. I have never been able to control it at will. It only happens when I feel a strong emotion and need to be somewhere.
Very well.
Nuin moved so swiftly I didn't realize what he was doing until the crystalline dagger was already flying through the air toward Heru. No! I shouted. Time stopped and misty tendrils of color surrounded me. One moment I was standing beside Nuin, the next I was in front of Heru, staring at the dagger. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, clearly made of art, and its point was barely a foot from Heru's shocked face. I shot Nuin's frozen form a scathing glare, then wrapped my fingers around the dagger's hilt, thinking it would be so easy if the thing would just cease to be. My fingers started sinking into the hilt, and I watched, amazed, as the entire dagger reverted to its original state, a liquid hunk of quicksilver goop. I released it, and it dissolved into a colorful mist, and was gone. Whoa! Heru's arm was suddenly swinging through the air, and I barely had time to duck before his attempt to swat the no longer existing dagger away struck me instead. Crap! I hissed as I fell back on my butt. At least the sand was soft. It took Heru several seconds to process what had just happened. As his eyes settled on me, sprawled on the ground, they widened, his lips parting.
How? You were there?
He pointed in Nuin's general direction.
But now you are here. And the dagger.
I tossed another glare at Nuin over my shoulder, and when I looked back at Heru, he was kneeling on the sand before me.
Are you all right?
He asked. All but my pride. I accepted his hand and stood, brushing off my backside and shooting several more glares Nuin's way. Heru stared at me, his eyes filled with awe.
It is true. You are a goddess. For the moment, yes, that term is very appropriate for her,
Nuin said.
Very good, Alexandra. Now jump to Seth.
I let go of Heru's hand and, planting my hands on my hips, turned to face Nuin. Are you going to throw a knife at him, too? Nuin grinned.
Only if I must. Once you are able to use the power at will, I will not have need of such motivations.
As it turned out, he had 3 more aught knives secreted away in his kilt. He only had to use 2. 25. Revelations and Reservations. I was exhausted by the time Nuin said I was finished practicing spatial shifts. Each successive jump took more concentration, and the lag time between jumps increased steadily until Heru, Seth, and Nakure had to steady me with sure hands when I appeared before each of them. Only when I lost consciousness for a few seconds, awakening with Heru's arms holding my slumped body tightly against him, did Nuin relent.
Was it really necessary to push her so far?
Heru said. I patted his sides. I'm all right. I can stand. He helped me get my feet securely under me and released all but my elbow, which he held onto with a firm grip. I was grateful. I wasn't sure I could balance on my own. Turning away from Heru, I watched Seth approach Nuin.
Surely you did not need to make Alexandra.
Nuin cut him off with a hard look.
I am doing what is necessary to keep her alive. To prolong her life, you mean,
Seth countered. Clasping his hands in front of him, Nuin took a deep breath, giving off an aura of placid unconcern.
Until she may complete her tasks, yes.
I exhaled heavily. Nuin, how am I supposed to complete these tasks if I don't even know how I'm supposed to complete them? Nuin stared at me for a long time, his expression turning considering. Finally, he nodded.
I will tell you part of what the future must hold for you. I had intended to save this information until the final moments before you departed, to avoid complicating things for you here, you see. But he shook his head serenely. I suppose I do not see the harm in it.
His eyes flicked to Heru, then settled back on me.
And considering the unexpected restraint you have been showing, I think only good will come of telling you now, dear Alexandra, so I shall, in private.
He glanced at Haru, Seth, and Nikure.
You may return to camp.
Haru released my elbow, lingering near me for a few seconds, probably to make sure I wasn't about to collapse. I wasn't. I already felt notably steadier. At the sound of his retreating footsteps, I had to force myself not to turn around and follow him. Nuin held his hand out to me.
Come, my Alexandra, sit with me.
I approached, keeping a watchful eye on him, and accepted his hand when I reached him. It was finally starting to sink in that my knowledge of this man, this god, barely scratched the surface. Proceeding with caution seemed like a really good idea at the moment. With a sigh, Nuin drew me down to the sand. He sat cross-legged, and I knelt on the ground in front of him. He studied me with somber eyes, their swirling colors appearing a little duller than usual.
I've relied on the knowledge I gained from the art for too long, he said in English, and it would seem that I no longer have a knack for doing things the old-fashioned way.
Doing things?
Yes, you know, living, making decisions, confiding in others.
Frowning, I shook my head. So, what are you saying?
I assumed that certain personal matters would progress differently, naturally, and far more quickly than they have, but my assumption was clearly false, he said with another sigh. And now I see I am at fault, because I have not been open enough with you, dear Alexandra.
Personal matters? Are you talking about Heru and me? Nuin nodded.
Your connection to each other is quite strong, and it grows stronger every day. I assumed your relationship would have developed into something more physical at this point, considering...
Again, I was shaking my head. But we can't have a physical relationship. If I bond with Heru, and then I snapped my fingers. Poof, I'm gone. He's dead. Nuin narrowed his eyes, and his lips curved into a secretive smile.
Ah, and now I see where I have erred. I thought I explained something far better than I had.
Laughing quietly, he shook his head.
If you and Heru bond in this time, he won't die when you leave.
But...
because you will save him.
I searched Nuin's face, his mesmerizing eyes, trying to understand. But how? By extracting a bunch of my bonding pheromones for him to keep until we meet in 4,000 years?
No, dear Alexandra, you could not extract enough to last so long. No, I am speaking of a different matter entirely. Don't you recall my mentioning that you could use the shoot within you to create a block within another that would forestall withdrawal symptoms indefinitely?
I blinked several times, searching my memory, then slapped my palm to my forehead. I felt like such a blind, bumbling idiot. You said I couldn't create something like that within me, but you never said I couldn't create a block for Heru. I laughed out loud, not quite ready to let myself believe that bonding with Heru, in this time, was really possible. I can't believe I didn't understand what you meant. Nuin smiled broadly, but his expression quickly sobered.
There is one caveat that you must be very conscientious of.
I raised my eyebrows.
Once the block is in place, the next time you and Heru have intimate contact.
Define intimate contact.
Nuin laughed softly. Sexual intercourse, Alexandra.
My eyes widened, but I nodded for him to continue.
The moment the two of you achieve a fully realized union of your two bars, the block will be shattered, and Heru will once again be subject to the regular onset of bonding withdrawals. should the two of you be separated again and the block not be reset again.
I chewed on the inside of my cheek. But it could be. Reset again, I mean. Right? Nuin nodded.
As many times as is necessary.
So, it's really possible. Haru and I can really be us? Nuin nodded and clasped his fingers together, resting his hands on his ankles.
In fact, I believe it may be essential that the two of you truly be together during your time here.
I tilted my head to the side. Essential? To what?
To your survival, dear Alexandra. You see, the only way to purge the shoot from your body and have you survive is for it to be naturally siphoned into another being, binding it with another ba within you.
My brow furrowed. Huh? Nuin smiled.
Once you've returned to your time, you must bear a child.
My mouth fell open.
Two, in fact. One to bind with the shoot within you, and one to bind with the shoot within the Heru of your own time.
What? I was shaking my head and staring at him with widened eyes. But, I can't. It's not physically possible.
But it is physically possible.
I snapped my mouth shut.
Bonding has many side effects, one being the increased dependency between the bondmates on each other's bonding pheromones. Another being the triggering of a rare, dormant fertility hormone in the Negeret's body. Once activated, this fertility hormone suppresses the Negeret's regenerative abilities for the duration of the pregnancy.
He paused, then explained.
Only once the Negeret's system is saturated with enough of the combined bonding pheromones of both bondmates will the fertility hormone be triggered, regeneration suppressed, and successful conception a possibility. He smirked, which is why it is my belief that you and Heru must achieve a physical relationship in this time. It will take much more intimate contact between the two of you to exchange enough bonding pheromones for your body to reach that critical saturation point.
I had started shaking my head again and forced myself to stop. Taking deep breaths, I released my skirt and pressed my hands against my knees, trying to make Nuin's words make sense. He reached out and touched the back of my hand.
And when your body finally does reach the critical saturation point and the fertility hormone is triggered, both Apep's shoot, assuming it's all within Heru, and the shoot within you will naturally gravitate toward the newly forming ba within your uterus, safely separating from your own ba and Heru's. And the two shoots will cause this new ba, and therefore the embryo, to divide into two separate beings. And you will carry twins.
Nuin smiled, and his face lit up with so much wonder and glory that some of it should have spilled into me. It didn't. Twins, I breathed. He nodded.
And they will be more than human, more than Negeret.
Twins. I cleared my throat. Like, two of them. At once? Nuin chuckled.
Yes, my Alexandra, and as I said, it will take a while to reach the critical saturation point. So if you want your body to be anywhere near close to the point by the time you return to your own time, I'd highly suggest that you, how do you say it?
He squinted thoughtfully.
Ah, yes, clear the air with Heru.
And soon,
lest you run out of time before the shoot destroys you.
I swallowed roughly. Suddenly my heart rate sped up as I realized that if I wanted to be with Heru in this time, if I wanted to prevent my own impending death, I would have to tell him everything. That's it for this episode of Read by the Author. I'll be back next week to continue the story. Until then, happy reading.